They called her a freak at the auction before the bell even finished ringing, a hush splitting around the girl, like water around stone. The crowd already weighing her with the lazy cruelty of people sure they won't be challenged. She stood barefoot on the plank with a price tag pinned to a faded shawl, less than a sack of feed, and when the bidding scraped the floorboard instead of the sky, the sheriff stepped through the doorway, slow as a storm rolling in, and bought her a dress. Not silk, not lace. A plain dark dress from the dry goods table. A thing of modest cut and stubborn thread. The kind of cloth that doesn't tear when a life starts pulling. The murmur rose. Someone laughed. Then he set the dress on the plank beside her and said, "Worth," quiet enough to sound like a warning and a promise at once. The gavel cracked. The crowd swayed. They thought they knew what was being sold. They were wrong. The room smelled of dust and boiled coffee and rubbed coins, and the light fell in hard angles that made everything look like it had been counted twice. She felt every stare as a push between her shoulder blades and kept her eyes on the dress, because it was the only thing in the place that wasn't looking back. She was nobody's kin and everybody's rumor. A girl taken in by a tinker who died too soon. A girl who could read knots and maps of men. A girl who'd once told a milling foreman his grain would sour before the week was out and been right. Freak, they said like a verdict. She tasted iron. She listened, in the hush between bids. She heard the floor complain beneath the auction block in a way timber shouldn't. Not rot, pattern. The plank had a seam where no seam should be, a line that ran like a river underwater. Her fingers twitched. She remembered the tinker's voice. When with talks, you listen with your hands. They pushed her down from the plank to stand beside the dress, told her to be decent, told her to be grateful. The sheriff had paid for cloth, but not for her silence. He stood with his hat in his hand, and his jaw set in that way people call stubborn when it belongs to a poor man, and leadership when it belongs to a rich one. At the rear, a cluster of men leaned together, a clique with polished boots and small smiles. One voice carried without being loud, always did. He was the mouth of the crowd, the kind who never put a knife on the table until he knew which way the light would fall on the blade. He said freak twice, and the second time sounded like policy. She reached for the dress and felt the weight of it, the honest heft of thread and promise. And then she let her hand hover over the seam of the plank, a breath above the wood, feeling the cold of what should have been warm. There was iron beneath, a latch or a brace or a box. The auctioneer rattled a ledger. Numbers slid off his tongue with the sheen of oil. The sheriff's eyes flicked to her hand, and then to the floor, and then to the men in polished boots. He saw it too, or he saw her seeing it, which amounts the same. He moved closer, not the way a rescuer moves, but the way a man positions himself between a spark and a barn full of hay. The mouthpiece smiled without showing teeth and offered the sheriff a private word. The sheriff said not now. The mouthpiece said it a friendly word. The sheriff said that kind usually costs. The girl tasted the air, chalk dust, oil rope, the thin sting of iron filings. She thought of the tinker's traveling chest, with its false walls and nested drawers, how things that matter announce themselves in negatives, silent spaces where noise should be, weight where light should live. She knelt, slow enough to be read as obedience, and the crowd leaned forward as one creature, breath pooled, the word freak swelling like a bellows. Her palm found the hairline of the seam, and followed it until the tiny snag of a recessed ring caught the edge of her nail. She looked at the sheriff. He gave the smallest nod any man could give and still call it consent. She slid the ring free, Wood sighed. Somewhere behind the mouthpiece, a boot scuffed, a watcher who hadn't planned for noon to become a reckoning. The girl lifted the plank corner just enough to smell old paper, mouse nest broken by time, the dull bite of sealing wax. The auctioneer cleared his throat hard enough to bruise it and declared the sale concluded, the lot dispersed, the hall closed. The sheriff's voice, never loud, cut the room anyway. Leave it open. The mouthpiece's smile thinned. He said there were rules. The sheriff said there were records. Records, the girl thought, like the ledgers that decide if someone is a person or a problem. The crowd's music changed key. Interest, then unease. The mouthpiece called for decency, for the sanctity of business. He offered to buy the dress back at twice the price. He offered to outfit the girl proper if the sheriff would just shut the plank and forget the floor like everyone else had. The girl felt rope-burn memory flare in her palms, not from rope, but from a life pulled hard. She said plain, "There are names in there." The mouthpiece said there were none worth speaking. She said, "Then you won't mind if I read them." A groan from the far door, and the marshal's deputy slid in sideways, already in hand, his eyes toggling between the sheriff and the clique like a dog trying to catch two thrown bones. The deputy represented the institution that bends with the strongest wind while claiming to be a tree. The girl lifted the plank. Not too fast. Let them hear the creak. Let the hush fall like snow. Paper whispered. She saw blue-edged envelopes with seals mashed flat by heat, a ledger bound in canvas, a tin stamped with crest she'd only seen on very fine letterhead. The kind that said bills in ink that didn't fade. She saw marks in the ledger that weren't numbers at all, not at first glance. A set of small circles carved beside certain names. A code you'd miss unless you'd spent a winter tracing the tinker's traveling routes by the notches he left under wagon benches for himself and no one else. Circles. Payments taken under threat. Triangles. Land transfer without witness. Crosses. Someone who had tried to fight and been made example. She found, wedged against the joist, a string of receipts bound with wax thread, the kind of mill uses when the scales and the truth disagree. The mouthpiece moved forward 2 steps, hands open, voice honeyed to the point of rot. He said the town had grown through practical arrangements, that not everyone could be pleased, that the contents of any box were surely the private business of the auction house and its patrons. He said the word private the way men say lock. The sheriff did not touch his gun. He did not need to, but he shifted his weight, and the badge on his chest caught the light. He asked the deputy if he was prepared to witness the reading of names into the record. The deputy's eyes showed the math, quick and ugly. He nodded because the crowd was watching, and the mouthpiece hadn't given him a safer script. The girl opened the ledger. The first page smelled of smoke the way a coat smells of last winter's fire. Names, dates, amounts, a pattern of circles and triangles like a map carved by someone who knew a town better than the town knew itself. She read 3 names and the room changed. The men at the back straightened and then tried to look relaxed. A woman near the door pressed a hand to her mouth and said a single word that sounded like debt. The mouthpiece's voice sharpened to a blade. He offered again, not money now, but protection. Close the book, put the plank back, and the girl will be escorted someplace safe. The sheriff kept an office. The gossip steered to kinder water. The girl said, "That would be unwise." He said, "Are you threatening me?" She said, "I'm trying to save your life." The deputy flinched like a man hearing thunder and remembering an open field. The sheriff asked the auctioneer for the official seal. The auctioneer produced it with shrugs can't help habit. The sheriff said the records would be taken into custody. The mouthpiece said the sheriff would regret the overreach. The girl traced a thumb along the code marks until her skin remembered them like braille. She could see the path the money took, the way certain families lost land the day before taxes were due, the way the same 2 initials appeared beside each transfer. She spoke those initials. Heads turned toward one man who had always been in the middle of everything while pretending to be slightly above it. His face did a thing faces do when the part of the skull called shame meets the part called calculation and loses. He stepped forward to deny, which is when the door burst and 3 farmhands with rope on their belts and dust on their boots came in because word moves on feet faster than on paper. One of them, older, the kind who keeps receipts in a tobacco tin and dead sons in a quiet drawer of the heart, said he had seen that ledger before years back, before his mortgage jumped like a snake, before cousin was made to sign what he couldn't read. He was the witness the story had been waiting for. He wasn't loud. He was solid. He told the deputy how the clerk at the land office had refused copies and how a night rider in a fine coat had promised mercy in exchange for silence. The mouthpiece said those were wild claims. The girl lifted the tin crest of the light, and someone in the crowd named it. The syndicate mark from the last bond issue, the one that had paved the road 3 times and never made it smooth. She set the tin down like a gavel. "Choice," she said to the deputy. "Help expose the truth or go down with it." The deputy looked at the badge in his own hand, as if seeing it for the first time. He said he would witness. He would serve papers. He would secure the room. He said it in a voice that wanted to be braver than it had been yesterday. The mouthpiece tried one more angle, mercy. He offered to make the girl's past vanish, to call off the whispers, to grant her a name that wouldn't be followed by a laugh. She said a name is a record, not a rumor. She turned the pages. She read off parcels like a slow bell tolling, each one a piece of ground that remembered boots and seeds and the weight of a cradle. With each name, the crowd moved from murmur to stillness to that held-breath place where decision lives. The sheriff marked each entry with the auction seal, one heavy stamp after another, the sound syncing with heartbeats and the up and down of chests in the hot room. The mouthpiece's men, one with a scar that said he was used to finishing conversations with his hands, shifted forward. The sheriff raised a palm. "Stand here and be counted," he said. "Or step outside and be measured later." A pause. A scuff. One man left. Two stayed, and in staying, they changed sides without saying a word. The deputy, sensing which way would keep his roof on, called for a second deputy from the street. Boots thumped. The auctioneer, who had spent a career adding columns meant to hide as much as they revealed, rolled his shoulders like a man shedding a skin and whispered where copies were kept, in a pigeonhole behind the north ledger shelf. Under a false back. The girl fetched them, and there they were, duplicates that matched the book, ink that did not burn. The mouthpiece tried to speak, and found his mouth dry. He reached for righteous anger and found only arithmetic. Too many eyes, too many pages, too many stamps. The sheriff read the clause that permitted seizure when fraud touched a public auction. He read it like a hymn. The deputy took the tin crest and the receipts into a canvas sack meant for coin, but better used for truth. The farmhand with the tobacco tin nodded once and said his cousin would testify. Someone at the back, the baker, flour on his sleeves like frost, said he would too. The girl held the dress to her chest and felt, for the first time, the weight of cloth as something like armor. Freak, she thought, and then let the word fall and shatter into letters on the floor. Worth. Proof. Choice. She didn't smile. The story wasn't done. They moved the whole mess into daylight, because that is where rot shows best. On the steps, the crowd became a community under the pressure of seeing itself. The deputy posted a notice. The sheriff spoke names without spit or spite, just a clean weight of syllables. The mouthpiece tried the last refuge of power, delay. He asked for time. He asked for discretion. He asked for the kind of quiet that had fattened his accounts for years. The girl said tonight. He said that was impossible. She said the town had already waited years. 15 minutes would be enough for the rest to arrive. And they did. The surveyor with his chain and notebook. The teacher with copies of signatures that did not match. The widow with mortgage deed and a memory like a ledger. The shopkeeper who had kept the marked envelopes because he smelled smoke on them and knew one day someone would need to see. The institutional face turned as faces do when paper gathers like clouds. The deputy became bolder with each witness. The sheriff placed the crest and the ledger on a crate and let anyone look, one by one. No tearing, no pocketing, no magic, just a record a town could touch. The mouthpiece's allies split like water to stone, some to the edges, some to the church steps, some to the sheriff's side with a righteousness that arrived exactly on time. An older woman stepped forward. The seamstress who'd mended every torn hem in town for 40 years, and touched the dress. She said the girl would need it, not for decency, but for walking into rooms without asking permission. She looked at the sheriff and then at the deputy and said, "You'll take this to the auditors." The deputy nodded. The sheriff said he'd ride at first light. The girl said, "No, tonight." He looked at her and saw not a freak, not a rumor, but a person who put a shoulder to the biggest locked door in town and felt it move. He nodded once. The arrest began with no shouting and no parade, just the quiet sound of boots turning toward a place where keys live. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They watched. They waited. They weighed. And then they began to speak to each other in low, firm voices about repairs that mattered. A board to the floor so no box could hide in again. A public ledger posted weekly. A rule that any sale over a sack of feed would have 3 witnesses, and a copy hung in the grocer's window for all to see. The girl stood with the dress folded over her arm and felt the odd lightness that comes when a weight shifts from rumor to record. She thought of the tinker's chest, of hidden drawers, of how worth reveals itself to the patient hand. The sheriff asked if she had a place to go. She said she had one now. Not a house. A role. He nodded and didn't ask her to define it. The deputy brought paper, and she printed, slow and careful, her name in a witness line. Small at first, then darker, like a road paved once properly at last.